So this was a few months ago, and quarantine was already in place, so I spent a lot more time at home and around the home than usual. There is a park very close to my house, so one day I decided to go for a little jog. I ran from my house to the park, and since I don't do a lot of cardio, I decided to take a little break. I noticed that a guy was looking my way, but I didn't think anything of it, until I started jogging again and he started walking the exact same time. Since I was jogging, I eventually lost him, so I thought that was over. Oh, I was wrong. It's now many hours later and I'm sleeping, when through the window I noticed car lights coming back and forth on my street. The window of my room gave me a view of my street. Now, some may think it's normal, but I live in a very quiet neighbourhood, so I wanted to see what was going on. As I thought, there was a car that was travelling back and forth on my street. Then the car stops right in front of my house, and the same guy comes out of the passenger seat, which means that there's at least another person with him. Until that point, I was half awake, but the sight of the same guy looking up to my window, seeing me and smiling, woke me the hell up real quick. I immediately closed the blinds, which are a tiny bit see-through by the way, and climbed in my bed, phone in hand. After a few minutes, I fall asleep, only to be woken up by a light tapping on my window. Remember when I said that my blinds are see-through? Well, I could make out the silhouette of a man. Probably the same guy, since there were still car lights in the street, and he was crouched at my window, tapping from the outside. The first thing that comes to mind is not to move and try and pretend that I'm still asleep, not knowing if he could see inside my room or not. And then I remember that my room is on the second floor. How the hell did he climb onto a little roof area outside my window? I have no idea. I slowly pulled the covers over my head and called the police, whispering and telling them that this guy was still tapping. They told me to slowly get out of reach of the window, in case he breaks in or something like that, and they said that they'd be there in 5 minutes. I crawled out of bed and into the bathroom, where I could see the street behind my house, and waited. After a couple of minutes, I heard the knocking stop, and then silence, and then a huge thump, then more silence, and a knocking at my door downstairs. I was still on the phone with the operator when I heard someone call out that it was the police and that the guy was gone. I told the operator that the police had arrived and they told me to wait. There was silence and she said the police had not arrived yet and not to open the door under any circumstances. Soon enough, she tells me the police are there now and that I can open the door. I go and check outside my bedroom window out of paranoia, and there were in fact 3 police cars and about 5 or 6 officers outside my house. I go downstairs and one of them is knocking, and I open the door, thank the operator and hang up. I tell them the whole thing and they tell me that the guy was already gone when they arrived, but no one was there anymore. In the next days, I saw the officers on my street, but I never got any news about the guy. The only thing they found was a rope and a small knife. No fingerprints, no guy, no car, no nothing. I sat on a wooden bar stool behind the register in the nastiest gas station I've ever seen before or since. It was my 3rd night in a row on the graveyard shift, despite my constant pleas for daylight hours. At night, the place became purgatory. No matter how hard you'd scrub or how many times you'd mop, a thick film of filth remained on every surface. I would go for hours without seeing a single car drive past. I often questioned if the rapture happened and I was the only one left. We were a stone's throw from another 24-hour gas station franchise that was cleaner, properly lit, and had an equipment update within the last decade. Needless to say, I had a lot of downtime. It was midnight, and I had 6.5 hours to kill. I was reading from the first volume of Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, and doing my best not to look at the clock. As I would soon learn, I was being irresponsibly unaware of what was going on around me. Out the corner of my eye, I saw a brown wood panel station wagon pull up to a pump. 2 men exited the car and walked inside. One looked older. He was wearing a leather jacket and the same shade of brown as his vehicle. The younger guy was close to my age. He wore a faded car hat, coat, and work boots. Both were covered in a layer of dirt or dust that suggested recent manual labour. These were country gentlemen. I agreed them and asked how I could help them. They told me they're not interested in buying anything, but they'd stop to make sure everything was okay here. I was appreciative, albeit visibly confused. The younger man asked me, "Did you know you're being watched?" as he subtly gestured outside. Sure enough, I saw the dark outline of a man standing completely motionless near a streetlight. None of his features were visible, but I could tell he was staring directly at us. The older man said they'd been driving by 45 minutes earlier and almost hit him as he was standing in the middle of the road. He theorized the man was possibly on drugs. They decided to take the long way home that night to see if the guy was still hanging around. Mind you, this was 45 minutes after they almost ran the guy over. Had he been there watching me the entire time? I looked outside again to see he hadn't moved a muscle. He was positioned on the border of the streetlight's illumination. I noticed his jaw was moving like he was saying something. I asked the younger man to lock the deadbolt on the door. Literally my line of defense in this situation. They both agreed to wait with me in the store until I contacted the police. Until that moment, I maintained composure, trying not to make it obvious that I felt extremely vulnerable. Here I was, at the mercy of 3 complete strangers, hoping the two in front of me were genuinely there to help. When the dispatch officer confirmed that they had units on the way, I felt safe enough to end the call. I thanked the 2 men profusely and they walked out the door. After pausing for a moment, they turned around and came back inside. The younger one plainly stated, "Lock the door, he's coming this way." He then immediately ducks back out the door so I can lock myself in. As I flipped the deadbolt into position, I could see the dark figure moving towards the building at an intentional pace, making it across the parking lot in about 10 strides. He tried opening the door, but it wouldn't budge. He then tried to buy me some time by saying that I was in the bathroom and I'd be back in a minute. So this man, this possible assailant, walks around the corner towards the bathroom door and disappears behind the building. And of course, we didn't have cameras outside to keep employees safe on the job. The only 3 working security feeds happened to be all trained exclusively on where the cashier would stand. It felt accusatory. It was at this point when the real fear began to set in and I lost my composure. This unidentified man, who had been apparently watching me for close to an hour, was now laying in waiting for me to exit the bathroom. I started to hyperventilate as thoughts of what his motivation could be. Had he been watching me before tonight? Was my store chosen at random, or did this guy just come here because he saw a small female at register? Was he actually on drugs, or was he just mentally unstable enough for it to appear that way? Did he have a weapon on him, or did he plan to use his bare hands for whatever he was going to do? I peeked out the window and saw the 2 gentlemen exchanging glances and mute discussion of how to proceed from there. Thankfully, a local police SUV tore down the street and into the parking lot of the building next door, turning his flashers on and quickly coming to a stop. As soon as I was absolutely sure the man was gone, I sat on the curb outside, sucking every last drop of nicotine out of my cigarette I held in a trembling hand. As if I telepathically summoned her, my phone rings with a call from my best friend. She says she was thinking about me and thought she'd call to say what's up since she knew I was bored. All I could respond with was, "Get here now." 20 minutes later, all my roommates showed up in a pickup truck and stayed with me long enough to feel comfortable again. As anticlimactic as this ended, it could have been a lot worse. I could have been robbed or murdered or anything else, all because I wasn't paying attention. I'll never know the true will of that dark figure under the streetlight, and maybe that's for the best. I don't think I could easily get past knowing what could have lied in store for me, and I wish I could have gotten one of the gentleman's contact information so I could send a beef jerky bouquet or something manly that says thank you. So, dark figure under the streetlight, once you're out of the clink, let's never meet.
When I was approximately 3 years old, I had 2 experiences that at the time I did not quite understand. The first time I thought nothing of it, even though it seemed to surprise my family. But as I'd gotten older, I had become increasingly interested in all things supernatural and anything related to it. My first experience is more memorable. Like many young kids, I would talk to someone while playing alone. My parents had passed it off as an imaginary friend and entertained the idea when I could talk about it. Whenever they would mention that my friend was imaginary, I would become upset and protest, saying the guy was real. For about 2 months, I would have a sort of routine that I would go through daily. Just a disclaimer, the explanation I'm about to write is both from memory and what my parents remember me telling them. My mum also decided to record me one day while playing with my friend, and also asked me to explain him in the video. All of what I'm about to explain was obviously not seen by my parents, because I believe it was something supernatural, and that only I could see him. So, I would sit on the couch staring out the front window of the house until an old orange pickup truck would pull into our driveway. A fat man with a dog would get out of the truck and come inside. The man's name was John, and the dog's name was Lucky Duck. We would go into our living room and play for a while, and then when he had to leave, I would walk to the door and say goodbye to him and his dog. My mum was curious, and so she asked me to describe my imaginary friend. I told her the man's name and that he was fat and could be kind of mean sometimes, but that he was usually nice when we played. I also told her about dog and that it was very mean and I was never allowed to pet it, but I was glad to see it anyway. This all happened at about the same time every day, as if it were on a schedule. After a few months, my mum noticed that I had not been playing with my imaginary friend anymore, and wondered why. That's when I told her that he had told me that he couldn't come over anymore, that was the end for me, and I'd never mentioned him again. Soon after that, my mum had been talking to my grandma on my dad's side, and she told her about my imaginary friend. My mum said my grandma had become pale and looked extremely surprised. My grandma then pointed out to my mum that the description matched my grandma's father exactly. The truck, its colour, the appearance, the attitude, and the most surprising part was that his name matched, and the dog's name and description matched his favourite dog he had. My grandma doesn't believe in supernatural things, but she even thinks that there was something that came to visit me. And no matter if it was a ghost or an angel, it was her father. I'd never met this man in my life, as he had died many years before I was born. The dog he had, when he came to me, had died even further in the past. This first experience had made my father a bit nervous of me once he had heard about it. My second experience happened around the same time as the first, but I do not remember this one as well. Most of the story comes from what my parents have told me. My dad was home alone with me while my mother was at work. I had been sitting at the sliding glass door that led to our backyard for a long time, so my dad checked in on me, wondering what I was doing. I nonchalantly told him that there had been a woman standing in our yard for a long time. This of course made him nervous that someone had been trespassing and was watching me, so he came over to check. He obviously did not see anyone standing out there, but went outside to verify in case. When he returned, I yelled at him because I was getting mad that he could not see her just standing there not moving. I told him that I even watched him walk right in front of her when he went out. Becoming scared for and of what I was saying, he took me away from the window and wouldn't let me leave him until my mum got home from work. She asked me to explain what I had seen, and I tried to tell her the way the lady looked. I told her that it looked like a lady in one of your pictures, and also an angel statue we had in our house. She of course wanted to know which picture I was talking about, so I got her wedding photo album out from our bookshelf and pointed to a picture of her grandmother who lives in Germany. Again, like the last experience, I had never seen my mother's grandmother because she had died a long time before I was born. I'd never seen this lady again, but my family has always seriously believed I had seen an angel. I haven't told anyone outside the family and friends about these experiences, so I would love to hear what other people think. I can't for sure explain either of them, but I do believe they were supernatural. I'm also not sure whether or not they were both the same type of thing, or if they were different. Since then I haven't had any other experiences, but it has left me with a belief in the supernatural. It all started when my wife and I first visited her mother's new home. Her mother had remarried and lived in a decent-sized house out in Palm Desert. We would visit them when I had time off from work. I had taken a shower in the guest bathroom, and when I got out amongst the fogged-over mirror, there were 2 children's handprints. At first I thought it was a print from her 3-year-old sister Emily, and when I was done, we brought her in to see if she had done it. The prints were at least twice as big as hers, looking like they'd belonged to a kid of around 8. My father-in-law, after this incident, tells us that a little boy haunts the house as a joke. He says when his own sons were young, he saw a kid run in the kitchen while watching TV. Thinking it was his son, he got up and walked towards where the boy ran. When he opened his son's room, they were both asleep. Any kid can pretend to be asleep, which he didn't think much of. The next few times we come, Emily has started to talk about her imaginary friend, and we ask who it is, and she says the word ghost, which is something we've never talked about around her. We ask her where is the ghost, and she goes where her room is and points to the middle of the floor and proceeds to lay down like she's dead. We laugh nervously now, thinking there's an actual ghost there that's harmless, but it gets worse. Around February, I had to go away for work 2 to 3 weeks. My wife stayed over at her mum's house during my absence with our 2-month-old son David. She tells me that one night at 4 a.m. she's feeding David, and she starts to drift off to sleep. All of a sudden, the door in the bathroom starts creaking open, and she sees the arms of a little kid following it. The door closes, and she hears footsteps run and slam into another door. This can't be her Emily, because she's asleep with her mum. Now it's June, and we come to pick up her sister for 2 weeks, and that night, as we're asleep, my wife had a very realistic dream. In her dream, we had gotten into a fight, and when I left, she was in a tub of water holding something down, like a child drowning. She says she prayed to the archangel Michael for protection, but before it ended, she heard a very dark voice whisper in her ear, "You're doing great." 2 weeks later, we come back to drop off Emily, and she has a dream that night of a little kid whispering in her ear and laughing. Her mum then tells us a month before she was sleeping and had heard the same thing, except the child says, "Billy, he's coming." Then she hears heavy footsteps down the hall and feels her legs go numb, followed by a heavy hit in her chest that blacks her out. I'm not sure what's going on in that house. I'm honestly scared for them and my child when I'm going over there. If anyone knows how I can ward this off, it would be greatly appreciated. This all started when I was about 12. My parents had just gotten divorced, and I was in a pretty bad place. I still had imaginary friends at that age, but I imagine it's because I didn't really have many real friends. Anyway, I remember one friend in particular whose name was Zach. Now I met Zach when I was about 8, so you can imagine we'd been friends for quite a while. Since I had grown since I met Zach, I was starting to realize that something wasn't quite right about him. When I first met him, I saw he had a rope necklace around his neck. I didn't realize at my young age that it was a noose. The only reason I know it's a noose now is because I had met him by a tree as a child, where there is a rather large rope burn in one of the branches. Anyway, I started to realize that Zach wasn't the same as he had been when I first met him. He grew older like I did, which none of my other imaginary friends had done, and he was starting to act differently, kind of like most teenagers do, except he'd make strange noises and try to tell me who to trust and be friends with. When I didn't listen to him, he'd get angry. Now that I've grown up, I realize Zach isn't human, but little 12-year-old me didn't know that. Little me thought that maybe he was just angry, and he was. One night I was staying over at my friend's house. We had been staying up all night and watched scary movies that neither of us should have been watching. After the movies, my friend wanted to go to sleep, and I was pretty tired, so we did. That was a bad idea. At around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of someone opening the bathroom door. At first, I thought it was her dad getting home to check on us, as he worked the night shift and usually arrived at around 3 a.m. But I was wrong. It was Zach. I saw him right there in front of me, solid. I remember he had really dark hair and green eyes, and so many freckles. I wasn't scared, but I was confused. I only ever saw Zach by the tree where we met. I don't remember anything after seeing him at first. All I remember is my friend's mum yelling at me to come inside from the pouring rain. I was soaked and scared, and I couldn't remember why I was outside or how I got there. I just remember telling her that Zach wanted to play with me. I didn't see much of Zach after that. Maybe it's because I had told him to go away, and that he had got me in trouble. Well, I didn't see him until recently. I'm 23 now, and a caregiver for elderly and special needs patients. Needless to say, I'm well past the age when I should have an imaginary friend. The other night, I was caring for a client who lives in a pretty secluded area, which normally doesn't bother me, except it was getting dark fast, and I'm not a fan of the dark. I hate driving in it and being stuck in it. I was making her dinner as we were talking about her favorite show, America's Got Talent. She stopped in the middle of speaking and looked at me and said, "I have to ask you if you don't mind. Who is your handsome friend?" I wasn't sure who she was talking about, but I should note that this woman is sharp. She's got her wits about her and is smart. I turned and asked her what she was talking about, and she said, "The young man who came with you. Dark hair, pretty eyes. Says his name is Zach." I couldn't believe it. I thought Zach wasn't real. I was sure he wasn't. I didn't say anything to her, and just fed her before leaving. Today I was working with a special needs client who is nonverbal. He never says a thing. I took him out for ice cream and got him a bowl of chocolate, and myself mint chocolate chip. I asked him if he liked his ice cream, only expecting a nod. I got more than I bargained for. He looked at me and smiled and said, "You know that chocolate is my favorite, Cassie." My nickname is Cassie, but none of my clients know that. If they call me by my legal name, it's Sam, but this client has never called me anything because he can't talk. I think it's very clear that Zach is back in my life, and he's not going anywhere. But I have to wonder if Zach is a ghost or something much darker. When I was younger, I lived in this house in the middle of nowhere. It was very close to a cemetery. When we first moved in, I was 4, and we later moved out when I was 6. We ended up moving back in the same house when I was 8. I had 2 imaginary friends. They were the ages of 12. Their names were Ashley and Alyssa. I remember them so clearly. I even remember them helping me clean my room and keeping me company when I was alone. I thought it was odd how my parents could never see them, but they would laugh at me when I brought them up. I never counted them as imaginary. I did have an actual imaginary friend who I called Sarah, but I never saw her and I knew I created her, so I knew the difference between imaginary and non-imaginary. I would always have dreams of Ashley and Alyssa basically every night, and there was one dream in particular that I remember very clearly. I had this dream a couple of nights before my family and I moved out. It was also the last dream I had with them both. What was so weird about the dream was that the room was identical to the one I had when I moved back into the house. I had a different style bed. I had carpets this time, and my room was blue, not pink. In the dream, Ashley, Alyssa and I were on the bed. We were just talking. Then out of nowhere, they started laughing and pointed at the ground by my door. I looked at where they were pointing, and there were hundreds and hundreds of these small devils. They were the ones that you wind up. They all had odd-shaped keys in the back of them that you inserted and twisted for them to move. In my dream, I got up out of curiosity to see what they were. They started chasing me through my home, and I remember I woke up running, still being able to see them behind me. They disappeared once my dad ran into me, asking me what was wrong. As years passed, I forgot about the dream, and once I moved out, I never had a dream of Ashley and Alyssa and haven't seen them since. We ended up moving back in about 2 years later. I was older now, and I changed my room and the furniture I had in it, exactly like in the dream. I never really had anything creepy happen in the house, but when my family and I moved back in, odd things would happen. Lights would flicker, only in my room. Things would fall off shelves, pictures on my wall would just fall off my wall, and I would hear knocking coming from one of my closets. My television would shut off, and I would see things in the corner of my eyes. One day, I was cleaning my room. I noticed that by my closet, the one I would hear knocking in, there was a piece of wood on the frame popping out. I went on the ground and removed it, and I noticed that there was some kind of small hole just big enough to fit my finger through. That was on my wall, hidden behind the wooden frame. I go and look to see if there's anything there. I reach in with my finger, and I felt something. So I slide it out, and there was an old key. Not any kind of old key though, but the one specifically for the wind-up devils I had in the dream. I had completely forgotten about the dream up until this point, so it didn't really strike me as creepy or anything. A couple of nights passed since I found the key, and odd stuff started to happen. It was so bad that I didn't want to be in a room by myself. I knew there was someone with me. My door wouldn't open and slam shut. My lights would rapidly go on and off, and I would hear footsteps by my bed. All sorts of unexplained stuff was happening. One night, before bed, it hit me. The odd-shaped key was from my dream, and then I realized that my room was decorated the same way as in my dream. Everything suddenly made sense. There's been conspiracies that spirits can change their appearance, and also another saying that spirits are attracted to young children because of how much energy they have. What if they were people who died and were buried in the cemetery by my home, and they were changing their appearance so I wouldn't find them as scary, since, to me, they looked like kids too. Maybe this is just an odd coincidence, and all the other unexplained things are related to the fact that I lived very close to the cemetery. But I thought I would share it with you all, because still years later I think about my imaginary friends and that strange house, and I can't quite wrap my head around it. When I was a little girl, I tended to move around a lot, ever since I can remember. Since my parents worked at about 1 or 2 jobs at once, But one thing remained consistent. It was innocent enough for a child around my age. Roughly from 3 to 7, due to me moving around often, I never had any real friends for very long. So I made imaginary friends. I often wondered why at times, even though they would leave me from time to time, only to keep me up at night and getting me into trouble with my less than kind father. Though as I grew older, he got better at controlling his tempers. But then he had a hard time with that, which made me terrified to do anything around him. So I locked myself in my room whenever I wanted to play. You know, typical girl things. Dress up, dolls, puzzles, drawing, trying to sing like a Disney princess, and trying way too hard to hold out notes that put too much strain on your vocal cords. My imaginary friend, Lou, was never angry at me. In fact, Lou gave me confidence and bravery, and happiness was abundant. I called it Lou because, thinking back on it, Lou fitted feminine features whenever we played and had fun. But when my father was around, Lou became masculine and protective, though Lou consciously somehow knew it couldn't do anything physical to protect me from my father's random fits of anger and blind rage. Lou would simply go to another friend's house after my father's fists, but guaranteed Lou would return to me. So me being innocent and wanting to see my only friend, I waited for Lou, even sometimes pulled all-nighters just to be sure that she came home safely. One night, while pulling an all-nighter, my mum woke up for a midnight snack. She noticed my bedroom light was still on and came in assuming I'd had a nightmare. When she came into my room, she saw that I was picking up toys and picking out specific ones I had yet to play with along with Lou. "Honey, what are you doing? It's really late," my mother said. "But Mama, I'm waiting for my friend," I said, treating it as an everyday thing. But that only caught her off guard and gave me a questioning look, so I just continued. Lou said that she was going to her friend's house and will be back, like she always does when Daddy becomes angry. My mother was awestruck. Her baby girl was talking about an imaginary friend who would leave and come back, and chalked it up to an extreme imagination, but knew it was too good to be true, and looked around the room. Our home at the time was a rather old trailer in a cul-de-sac, and it was previously owned by a family of 3 women who were self-proclaimed Wiccans and enchanted the home with protective spells. Once my mother's search was complete and unfruitful, she let out a sigh and let it be. Some words about Lou. I'm 18 and still live with my mum and sister. My father has moved out but visits every now and then, and so does Lou. I mentioned how Lou always went away after my dad had his hissy fits, but what followed him was misfortune. Whether it be getting fired or caught cheating on my mother, it was always something, which I noticed as I reached middle school and a bit into high school. All I know is that even now that I moved into a totally different house that isn't a trailer, Lou still protects me and keeps in touch with my dreams. However, new house, new issues, and I've been seeing Lou as more masculine than ever and more protective, even without my father around. Why is she like this? What's out to get me? I don't know, but it's not good. I've seen figures, apparitions, heard voices, and been physically attacked. I feel like I'm a target. But of what? I hope Lou will help me get the answers soon.
I recently received a friend request that reminded me of this story, so I'm going to share it here. This happened after I went to university, so I was 18. I made an effort to make friends after I moved onto campus, and ended up with a few groups to hang out with, including a new girlfriend, and plenty of people from my classes that I liked well enough. There was one class before lunch where it was traditional for people to go to the cafeteria afterwards to eat in pairs or threes. I wasn't very discerning about who I'd have lunch with, because I got on fine with most people from the class, and we were all trying to make an effort to be social. So when one girl, Lily, asked if I wanted to eat lunch together after class, I didn't have a reason not to go. We talked about school and that kind of thing, nothing noteworthy, but she asked me to get lunch with her again the next week. It became a pattern, and there wasn't exactly a way to start saying no suddenly. It was fine, but it did mean I lost a chance to eat lunch with anyone else on those days. In hindsight, I suppose that was the point. One day in class, I asked someone if I could add them on social media. This happened in front of Lily. I saw her face jerk towards me from a couple of seats over. It was such a sharp reaction that it was hard to ignore, and I still remember it. By the time I got home later that day, Lily had sent me a friend request. No friends in common. Don't know how she knew my last name. I was a bit surprised, but I guess she just dug through the university social media pages and found me through there. It gave me a bad feeling, but surely it was fine. She ended up messaging me a lot and commenting on anything I posted. I told myself that she was just awkward, and we became friends, if not close. I'd known worse people. She still always got me to go to lunch with her after one of our shared classes. Other than that, we rarely spent time together in person. I saw her around sometimes, but I never went out my way to hang out with her. So it was mostly online messaging and seeing each other in group settings. Coincidentally, my girlfriend was also called Lily. This was something that clearly bothered Lily, not my girlfriend, who couldn't have found it less interesting, but it's a common name. She occasionally hinted that she wanted my girlfriend to pick a different name, or joked that it didn't suit her. She clearly didn't like my girlfriend at all, and I had no idea of why. It was hard to ignore by this point. Lily was starting to unsubtly hint that she had a crush on me. I tried not to address it, because what was I going to say? I'd never known what to do when a friend makes a pass at me. I was also not interested in the least. Even ignoring weird stuff she pulled, Lily wasn't my type at all. She tended to dress and act in a way somewhere between 50s housewife and one of those adults who's still obsessed with a Disney princess. If you can picture that. Things took an uncomfortable turn one day, on our last shared class of the year. Instead of asking me to lunch like she usually did, Lily asked if I'd go for a walk with her. Again, I didn't know exactly how to refuse, so I said alright. Our campus was bordered by a large patch of woodland. Lily led me into the woods, and the sounds of our fellow students slowly faded away. She sat down on a log and I joined her. She started talking about how she was going to miss me over the summer. I tried persuading her, but I didn't want to be there, especially because she seemed almost on the verge of tears. I think I tried to make an excuse about having plans with my girlfriend, but before I could leave, Lily chose to kiss me without warning. It was uncomfortable to say the least. I got out of there and was happy to think that I wouldn't see her for a while. I came back to university after the summer, moving into a house with my friends. Without going off topic, there were some serious issues in my friend group. A lot of petty arguing and worse. I broke up with my girlfriend around the start of the school year as well, and basically the whole mess made me recontextualise things with Lily, because suddenly it didn't seem as bad. That said, I didn't want to be alone with her. We mostly talked online. She was still constantly messaging me after all. One upside of everything is that I started dating a boy. Lily was not pleased to hear that news. I think she hoped to sneak in after I broke up with my girlfriend, but as I said before, that was never going to happen. There wasn't a big gap between my breakup and this new relationship, so she must have thought she missed her chance to be with me. This is where the story gets bad. At this time, I was fairly active on Tumblr. I occasionally talked about my life, and mostly reblogged photos and stuff. I was on there one day when something odd happened. One of the blogs I followed had received an ask with some phrases I recognised. It took a second to register that it was taken from my About page. That made me freeze. I read the message properly. Someone was asking this completely random person to analyse a section of a page from my page. asking for their opinion on the type of person who could write it. I cannot stress how messed up this is to see people talking about me like I was a character in a book they were trying to study. The reply was basically, I don't know, sorry. But the important thing was the question hadn't been anonymous. It was linked to someone's blog. Obviously, I wanted to know who had taken such a bizarre interest in me. As far as I knew, no one in real life, other than my boyfriend, knew about my page. Well, no prizes for guessing who was behind it. What I found was a shrine. She was using a fake name, but I recognised Lily all over that thing. It was this cutesy pink and red page. There were a few posts about her interests, but most of her content was focused on her primary interest, me. Most of the posts were about me. There were accounts of things I'd done recently. He told me about such and such, he went to a nightclub recently, etc. As well as references to things as far back as I'd known her. It was clear that she'd been keeping tabs on me, both online and offline, gathering up every scrap of information she could have about my life and holding it here in her collection. She talked about us eating lunch together and how special our dates had been to her, as if it was anything more than acquaintances getting food after class. She talked about the time she had forcibly kissed me in the woods, but she wrote it as if it had been mutual. She quoted lyrics from my favourite song and talked about how she would always be there for me, no matter who else came into my life. Lots of references to loving me just the way he is, which answered another mystery about an anonymous love letter I'd received earlier in the year with the same wording. It got worse. There were a lot of posts about my boyfriend as well. These weren't so nice. They got vicious, talking about how he didn't deserve me. He didn't know what he had. If she was with me, she'd be jealous of anyone who came near me. So my boyfriend not being a jealous person meant he didn't love me. It was angry and hateful. I didn't like to think about the sort of person who could write so obsessively, being fixated on me. One thing that didn't make sense at first is that the blog also made plenty of references to Lily's best friend Stephen. She'd never even mentioned this person to me. Her post talked a lot about Stephen and how great friends he was, and how much fun they'd had together, how he looked out for her, etc. I was trying to work out whether this was an online friend, when one specific post made it all click. She had posted a photo and captioned it with, "Stephen sent this to me. He knew I'd like it and I love it," or something like that. The problem was, the photo was taken from my own page. I hadn't sent it to her. She took it from my page and then claimed this fictional best friend of hers shared it with her, because in her head, she'd split me into two people. In her messed up fantasy life, I was both the perfect best friend who was also looking out for her, and her soulmate who was bound to end up with her when I finally got over my sweet and kind boyfriend, and all the other easy girls I hung out with that she made dozens of posts complaining about. Who was she complaining to? Oh, Lily had an audience. She asked open questions about me and her relationship with me, and got messages back from her followers, people who took what she said at face value. I saw a bunch of random people agreeing with this stalker that my boyfriend didn't deserve me, and we were bound to break up soon so I could be with Lily, the person I was clearly supposed to be with. She had this fake fanfiction version of my life for anyone to share their opinion on, and she'd made herself out to be a hero in it all. I went maybe a month back into this page's history. I did not look at everything that was there, it was too much, so I'm not sure how long this has been going on. I sent Lily a message confronting her about the blog. She said nothing. I cannot stress how weird it is to have found pages dedicated to me, with her talking about how she was in love with me and make sure we'd end up together, slamming my boyfriend and building a fantasy life with two different versions of me in that she clearly believed to be real, then acting like it hadn't happened. She said nothing. She didn't address it, she changed the subject, even after I pushed, and it was like she hadn't even registered what I said. I'd never seen anything else like it. She deleted the page, of course, or at least changed the name and hid it so I never found it again. It wasn't the end though. I wasn't going to hang out with her anymore, but we were still shoved together in classes, and she started to actually scare me with what she might do. I'm kind of a paranoid person. Knowing someone was obsessively keeping track of me for who knows how long freaked me out. The next thing she pulled was trying to seduce my boyfriend. It was an absolutely useless attempt that only made him uncomfortable. He told me about it right away. What was her plan there? Did she hope to tell me he cheated and wait for me to break up with him? Why would I want her after that? When that didn't work for her, she tried hitting on 3 of my other friends. None of them took the bait. She ended up dating one of my former housemates for a while, but made sure to send me messages while they were together, letting me know that she'd rather be with me. No thanks. Lily made sure to stay in my life the whole time I was at university. There was a time where I tried to pull away from her, and she ended up starting rumours about me and damaging my career opportunity I had put a lot of work into. I don't know what else she did behind my back, but it made me realise I was safer to let her think she was a part of my life while ignoring her, rather than doing something that would cause her to get angry. I graduated. Lily wanted to spend some time together, but I knew I didn't have to now. I made excuses about work and barely talked to her after this point. I almost entirely stopped posting on social media that I knew she knew about. Of course, she didn't give up that easily. She tried to start conversations, asked me to meet up with her, attempts I usually ignored. I didn't like to think that she was still tracking me online, but she probably was. I don't know how, but she'd occasionally reference things I mentioned online somewhere she shouldn't have known about. The last time we had a real conversation, she sent me a message out of nowhere. We hadn't spoken at all in months, and we hadn't talked about anything serious in much longer than that. Thinking about that conversation still makes my skin crawl, but I'll summarise what happened. At first, she asked me some questions about how long I'd known that I was queer. I told her some basic stuff, the kind of thing I tell anyone who asked. Then she changed the subject. She started talking about how I'd feel about her if she was a boy, about wanting to be a boy for me. The messages quickly became fetishistic. She went into plenty of detail about fantasies she had of the 2 of us. Again, we were not friends at this point. We'd never even been especially close, at least not from my perspective, and we'd barely spoken for years. I can't imagine sending messages like that to a close friend, let alone someone who barely knows you. I tried telling her not to pull this crap with me, but she decided to change her tactics. She sent me photos of herself, followed by a bunch of messages, maybe 4 or 5 a minute, way too fast for me to reply before the next one arrived, basically quoting back to what I told her about myself in the past. She was telling me these things as if they happened to her. She was role-playing as me. The worst part is that she seemed to believe it was real, that those things actually happened to her, even when she was quoting me word for word. Things I told her only hours before were now her life. It was as if she was trying to absorb my history, to take it over, to make my life part of her. Yeah, I didn't talk to her again after that. I ignored all future attempts she made to talk to me, and I eventually silently deleted her from the inactive social media, which was her only real way of contacting me. I really thought she might finally move on. A few days ago, she sent me a friend request. It's sitting here unanswered, because I know if I delete it, she'll only send another one. Lily and I met nearly 12 years ago. This story is just the highlights, and even then, it's only the stuff I know about for sure. A lot happened behind my back. I know it did. So to the girl who spent 12 years obsessing over me, fetishizing me, stalking me, and harassing me, let's not meet again. The fantasy life you built for the 2 of us in your head is the only place you'll be seeing me anytime soon. A few years ago, my husband was working swing shifts. At the time, we only had one car, so I'd drive him in and then pick him up, which was irritating because I had to wake up almost fully and drive him 30 minutes in, drive 30 minutes home, and then I could go back to sleep for an hour or so before I had to get ready for work. One day after I dropped him off in the wee morning hours, I stopped at a gas station not too far from his work to get a pack of cigarettes. When I came out of the store, there was a large white van parked beside my car. There had been a few warnings on Facebook about a white van in the area that was up to no good, so I took notice of it. Because there weren't a lot of people around, I found it strange that they parked directly beside my car, seeing as how there were many empty spaces around the lot. I headed to my car, already aware of the van, and 2 guys had popped out of it. They weren't very young or old, just average looking and a little dirty. I don't judge though, as they could have been working, so I continued walking towards my car. One of the guys yelled out to the other guy that he dropped his birth certificate. The second guy had a very confused look on his face. I didn't see anything come out when the passenger opened the door, so I knew he didn't drop anything, but I was thinking to myself, why would you have that with you? So, as I got between my car and the van, the driver fast walked around the front of the van and came up behind me, with the passenger in front of me, effectively blocking me between the vehicles. The passenger then asked me to look for his birth certificate, and I declined. He said, "Come on, help a guy out." I looked at him, keeping the driver in my sight and keeping my back to my car, and said no very firmly. By this time, I was standing right in front of my door handle, so I reached behind me, grasped the door handle and pulled. As I started to sit backwards into my car, the passenger reached for my arm, and I managed to pull my car door shut and lock the door before he could get my door open. I threw my car in reverse and got the hell out of Dodge. As soon as I was out of the parking lot, I called my husband, freaking out. Unfortunately, I wasn't thinking clearly and didn't get the license plate of the van. I couldn't believe how utterly stupid the passenger's excuse for hanging around between the vehicles was, nor how freaking brazen they were, as the local sheriff's department and the jail were walking distance to the gas station. So, to the guys in the white van, "Let's not me, I still have anxiety over this." In October of 2019, I went to a Halloween costume ball hosted at our local art gallery, which was organised by a Unitarian Universalist spiritual centre, whose members I have close ties with. It was a typical party, but had a few ceremonial attributes to celebrate Samhain. I dressed up as the Red Death from Phantom of the Opera, but basically went alone, thus waiting for a friend who did eventually come to meet up with me later that night. Before that, I had the most bizarre experience. Bizarre as in, I was unable to imagine a clear explanation behind this certain circumstance. I still can't think of one to this day. So, after dancing to the music and sipping a couple of drinks, I was interested enough to purchase a photographic aura reading from this lady in a little booth. I sat down and she instructed me to take off my skull mask and firmly lie my palms on a flat silver machine linked to her laptop. I was then instructed to look into a camera, and after a few minutes, my image appeared on the screen with a mix of transparent colours, along with various measuring charts. I was further intrigued and listened to the lady's explanations concerning chakras and the like. As I was trying to pay attention to her, something in my peripheral vision distracted me a bit. I decided to look directly ahead, and to my surprise, a group of 4 sitting at a table was staring at me and smiling back. 3 men and 1 woman. If their expressions weren't really friendly, then they were most definitely flirtatious. I can't recall if they ever blinked. I was a bit weirded out, especially since I wasn't wearing my skull mask. I didn't even think to wave back a hello. So I just ignored them and listened further to the lady's interesting lecture, helping me examine my aura. At the time, I couldn't help but feel being stared down from the distance. I looked ahead, and again, it was the same group checking me out. They just kept looking at me without even signalling to me to walk over to the table. I knew I wasn't hallucinating because I blinked and the group was still there, not making a single move. To be honest, I swear I've never met this group before, so I really don't know why they were staring at me like they already knew me closely. While not making it a big deal, the lady finished up what she wanted to teach me. I paid her and just got up to go to the restroom. I brushed off that strange experience as nothing. Afterward, my friend found me and we chatted until we had to leave for his mother's birthday outing. Interestingly enough, I then realised that the group never approached me after my aura session. I wonder what that was all about. Out of stubborn curiosity, I searched through the entire venue and didn't find them. Good thing I didn't end up telling a man that I had teeth in my rear end to scare him off. Well, that's pretty much it, and hopefully you are never as spooked as I was. So there was this girl I was talking to at the time, and I needed to have a talk. Yeah, that one. And we decided that we would go to our local college town statue to do so. Many kids that go to our college went to hang out there, take pictures, climb on the statue, college kid stuff. Basically, this statue was 30 minutes away from the middle of just farmland. The road to get there is a small, 1 lane each direction road, I don't know the story behind it or anything, but it's a popular, you'd think safe, place. So we decided to head out, and it was probably 1 AM at that point, so you could see the stars and all of that. It was pitch black outside. When we got there, I got a really creepy feeling, but we wanted to take a look at the statue, so we got out of the car anyway and proceeded to walk to the statue, about a 5-minute walk from the gravel parking spot. We take a look and decided to get back in my car because it was dark and cold outside. This is when I decided to keep my engine running and back up into the spot so I could look at the small road to see if anything was happening. About 10 minutes into our conversation, I see a large white SUV, I think it's an Escalade, drive past us. I didn't think anything of it, but it was the only other car we'd seen all night. The car drives maybe a quarter of a mile down the road and suddenly does a 3-point turn. Weird, but it's not a problem. He then comes back towards us and takes a right onto a side road that sat directly in front of us. At this point, I'm like, okay, he missed a turn, no problem. About a quarter mile down the side road, the SUV does another 3-point turn and is now facing my car directly. The SUV is stopped 100 feet or so in front of us, with its headlights blaring down my car, a compact sedan. Now, I was like, okay, this is super weird, I'm gonna get out of here. Suddenly, the car drives straight ahead into our gravel lot and sort of blocks off the only entrance and exit. The SUV then sits here again, and we're directly facing each other. At this point, all of my spidey senses are in full gear, and I'm ready to book it. The girl with me is like, no, we need to finish talking, he's just being weird. I decide to just start hauling ass, and as soon as I squeeze my car out of the lot onto the road, the SUV is tailing me. So I'm like, okay, this guy obviously wants to do something with us. I told the girl to call the cops, but of course, in the middle of nowhere, there's no service. I start to absolutely push my car, and I'm going 120 plus miles per hour on this small country road surrounded by nothing. And of course, the SUV is right on our tail. The road that we're on is straight of nothingness for 15 miles, and we continue driving. Once we finally reached to a sense of civilization, there was an intersection with other cars. I finally get my sigh of relief and thought this guy would leave us alone, so just to test or trick him, I turn on my left signal and get ready to turn. I turn my wheel enough so that it looks like I was going to turn, and then I put my entire weight on my gas and went straight. He followed me exactly, with the turn signal, turning, accelerating, everything. A couple of miles later, we finally get reception and call the police. As we're on the phone with them, there is a brightly lit gas station, one of those big ones, like Quick Trip or Racetrack, and we turn into that because if this guy's going to kill or kidnap us, he's going to have to do it where other people can see. As soon as I turn into that gas station, he books it and hauls ass wherever the hell he was going. We gave a description of what happened to us to the dispatcher and continued on our conversation. To this day, I don't know what the person wanted or what their objective was, but I'm glad I didn't find out. This story takes place in November 2017. I was 18. I'm a very short girl, 4'10", and I get anxious when someone even looks at me in a way to suggest they might not like me. So needless to say, I am incredibly non-confrontational. My friend and I were out shopping. It was something we'd do maybe every few months just to bond since we didn't have much time to hang due to college. She's just like me, barely scraped 5'1" and very non-confrontational. It's probably why we became friends. On every shopping trip, we'd find ourselves in Ann Summers. We're both overly endowed and struggle to find bras anywhere else. And Ann Summers had some great sales, so we'd grab at the cheap bras while we could. This shopping trip wasn't any different. We browsed shops until we got to Ann Summers, but that's when things took a turn. I had barely stepped foot into the shop when a woman with sort of a Slavic accent stopped me. Her finger jammed into my chest. "Spit the gum out," she demanded. Assuming she was an employee, I gave a very sheepish, "I'm really sorry," and ran out of the shop and spat my gum out and threw it away. When I went back in, I realised that this woman was not an employee. She was a customer who was browsing and happened to be near the door when my friend and I entered the shop. It should have been obvious to me at the time. No salesperson would ever have been like that. Not one that wanted to keep their job anyway. But I kept my head down, and when I walked past her, holding my breath in hopes that she wouldn't notice me again, she didn't, and I thought I was in the clear. My friend and I browsed the shop, trying to avoid the woman, but the shop wasn't very big, probably only 15 feet by about 18 feet, so eventually I ended up at the sales stand by the door where she had been stood. I tried to keep my distance while browsing. I was looking at the price tags, but realised I didn't know what the discount was, so I leaned over slightly to check the discount sign. It's important to note that this woman had a pushchair, which is a stroller for the Americans. You'd think that maybe she had a child in this pushchair, but no, it was full of plastic carrier bags. I didn't look too much at it, but I could tell that everything in there was double bagged and tied shut. Whatever was in those bags she wanted to protect. This sense of protection became very relevant because when I leaned over to look at the discount sign, I was leaning slightly close to her pushchair. She was about 3 feet away, but apparently it was too close. The woman was on the other side of the chair, but the moment she saw me, she ran around it to where I was stood. She hit me in the face. It was somewhere between a slap and a punch. I couldn't quite tell because I was in shock. All I knew is that it hurt. "Watch the personal space," she hissed in my ear. I apologised to her. This woman just hit me and I apologised to her. I regret it now, but at the time I didn't want to provoke her any further. Not that I knew that I did anything to provoke her in the first place. In shock, I turned around and ran to the back area, grabbing my friend's hand and pulling her with me. The back area was separated by a tiny wall that only stretched halfway across the shop since the adult toys were stored there and wanted to keep them out of sight from the general public. I stood there, holding my friend's hand and shaking as I whispered, "She just hit me," to my friend. We stood there for a good minute in silence. My friend was positioned in a way that she could see the rest of the store while I hid behind the wall. "She's gone," my friend told me. I let out a breath that I didn't know I was holding. "Can we stay in here a while?" I asked my friend, worried that the woman would be outside waiting for me. The front of the store was open, but she could have easily just been a couple of feet down the road and out of sight, waiting for me to leave. My friend agreed and we slowly browsed the shop again. About 5 minutes later, we got to the counter to check out. The girl working behind the counter looked outside, then looked back at us. That woman had been in here for 30 minutes. I didn't know what to do. She told the two of us. She told me to spit out my gum when we first came in, and then she hit me because I was too close to her, I told her. "She hit you?" The worker was wide-eyed. "If I'd known that, I would have called security. I'm so sorry." I smiled and shrugged. "It's fine." It really wasn't fine, but it wasn't the worker's fault. She didn't look too much older than I did, and I wouldn't have known what to do in her situation either. Still shaken up, my friend and I made our way out the store. I looked around, but I didn't see the woman. "Can we go home now?" I asked my friend. We hadn't finished browsing all the shops, but I was just so paranoid we'd bump into the woman again. She agreed, and we got the bus home. When I got home, my parents encouraged me to report the incident to the police. I called an emergency line, and their answer was basically, "Well, what do you expect us to do about it?" Unless I went back to the Ann Summers and requested the security footage, which I wasn't even sure if they actually had. They wouldn't do anything. It's been over 3 years now, and I'm sure that the woman was likely to have been homeless and or on drugs. It's the only explanation I can think of the carrier bags and her protectiveness. It was either everything she owned or drugs, or both. So, to the possibly homeless, possibly drugged up woman who hit me, I hope in the current state the world is treating you well and you're finally getting the personal space you wanted. But let's not meet again. This was several years ago now, when I was in college, and I was headed back to my apartment late one night after being out with friends. As I went to make a left turn into the complex, I checked to see if anyone was behind me, and since no one was in front of me or behind me, I opted not to worry about using a turn signal. I parked outside my building, and as I was crossing the street to get to my apartment, a car was driving towards me. I wondered where it had come from, since I was sure no one was near me when I turned in, but I was only 18, very short and naive, and instead of being cautious or fearful, I instead wanted to be helpful. The car stopped approximately 16 feet or so away from me as I was right in the middle of the street, and a man got out and asked, "Do you live here?" I thought maybe he needed directions, and I told him that I did live there. As he asked this, he's walking towards me, and as soon as I answered, he lunged at me, grabbed a handful of my hair with his right hand, and grabbed my throat with his left, and started dragging me to his car as he growled that he ought to cut my effing neck. To say that I was in shock was an understatement. His car was running with the door open, and it wasn't until I saw his car door before my brain literally used my name and said, "Caitlin, scream." Once I finally started screaming, he pushed me away while he jumped in his car and took off, and I ran to the apartment. I was shaking so badly I could barely get my key in the lock, and once inside, I realised my boyfriend was there because he'd usually come by earlier in the night to surprise me, but since I wasn't home, he'd gone off to bed. Of course I was still freaking out, but instead of him being concerned, he acted like an ass because he was upset that I was coming in so late and I didn't even call the police. Once I told my mum the next day, she insisted that I call them, but nothing ever came of it. I often wondered what the guy thought I did to deserve to have my effing neck cut. I'm sure it wasn't because I didn't use a turn signal, so I even wonder where he came from. I never wanted to meet him again, no one else ever did. Back in July 2018, me and my 3 best friends decided to go on a vacation to Barcelona. The 4 of us, all females, were 18 at the time and just finished our freshman year of college. For context, we had planned this trip for several months, but the lazy asses we are took our time before booking our flights and Airbnb. We eventually started our search in May, and if you have ever been to Barcelona, you might know that it's already pretty late if you want to find an affordable and well located summer accommodation. We ended up scrolling on several websites for days as everything was way out of our budget. One of my friends finally found this very decent studio located in the Ramblas, a very touristy neighbourhood. The condo was actually located on a narrow street that was perpendicular to the main Rambla. You had to walk about 500 metres, about 0.3 miles, until you arrived at a sketchier end of the street, where the flat was. It didn't really bother us, as the building was pretty secure. You had to open the first front door that led to the streets, and then you had to take the stairs to the second floor, where you had a second door which required another key. This second door led to 3 condos, so we had a third and final key to our personal flat. This final door didn't have any outdoor handle, which meant that if we were to leave without our keys, we would end up locked out. There was finally no outside handle on the balcony door either. You could only open the door from the inside. It might seem like a lot of details, but it's important for what comes next. The day we checked in, we're pretty excited despite our terrible exhaustion. We'd been travelling for 15 hours at that point, so we decided to go smoke a cigarette on the balcony. The balcony next to ours belonged to the next door neighbours, who were a bunch of Italian boys who we only met in that very moment. They'd been pretty loud throughout our stay, but we never thought too much of it. As last elements of context, our condo was disposed as follows. The front door led to the main room, which there was 2 of my friends were sleeping. There was a bed on the left, and at the end of the room was the living room, which also worked as a kitchen and bedroom. The sofa was foldable, where my 3rd friend and I were sleeping. We were there for 5 nights. As the young woman that we were, our daily routine was pretty consistent. We'd go clubbing every night, go home around 4 AM, pass out in our beds and wake up at 11. We'd then visit the city until about 7 PM and get ready to repeat. Our first 3 nights were awesome. We had made some male friends who were staying in Barcelona too, so we'd meet up with them and it was fun. Yet the 4th night was rather creepy. We'd gone home at 4 AM, screwed around with my friends for an hour until we fell asleep at about 5. Around 7:30, my friend who was sleeping with me in the room and suffers from sleep paralysis wakes up as she feels something is tickling her ankle. She opens her eyes and sees someone crouching at the end of the bed, his hand on her ankle, as if he was looking at something under the bed. At this moment, she's convinced that she's experienced sleep paralysis again, but the fear makes her sit on the bed and shout, "What the F?" which rarely happens with sleep paralysis as your muscles are often numb. The shouting wakes me up and I see the guy too, at the end of our bed, and still half asleep I whisper, "Edward?" I think I'd been dreaming about a friend of mine and confused this guy with him. The guy gets scared, suddenly gets up and stares at us, and then tiptoes away saying, "Oops, oops, oops." He walks past the bed where my friends are dead asleep and walks out the front door. My friend and I stayed up for a long time talking about what we'd just experienced, and then we woke the other girls up and told them the story. We never knew how this guy broke into our flat, and he didn't steal anything, even though we had ostentatiously left our credit cards, IDs, phones, and cash on the table. The only thing is, that night, we didn't lock the front door, but it was closed. So normally no one could open it as there was no handle, unless someone had a key. We chose not to talk to the police about it because of this, as it could have told us that we were responsible for not locking the door properly. We also chose not to tell the landlord for the same reason, but also because we didn't want it to ruin our last day there. We tried contacting the neighbours, the Italian guys, and went to their flat and knocked, but they never opened the door. Looking back at it, we should have definitely done something about it, as we shouldn't have stayed there for another minute, but we were too young, I guess. We never figured out what the guy wanted, nor what he was looking for under the bed. None of this makes sense, to be fair. Why would someone come to someone's place, uninvited, to look for something at 7:30 while the occupants are asleep? I guess we'll never know. This happened to me when I was 21, after an OD suicide attempt. I woke up in the hospital in the middle of the night to a nurse saying he needed to replace my IV. He jabs me 2 or 3 times but doesn't hit a vein, so I ask if I could get someone else to try. He says no and keeps going. As he's doing this, he's pushing and wiggling the needles around under my skin, saying he's trying to forget the vein. By the 7th or 8th needle, it registers that he's intentionally trying to hurt me. I ask him, "Why are you doing this?" He just says, "It's your own fault you're here." I was too weak to fight back, and it was the middle of the night. There was no one else around I could call out to. I have no idea how many times he ended up puncturing me in the end. The next day, a different nurse was talking about my IV. She was horrified because she said it was the biggest needle she'd ever seen used on a living patient. Not sure why you'd need to use needles on a dead patient, but that's what she said anyway. A lot of people shrug this off when I tell them about it, but it was so terrifying being alone, helpless, and knowing that the person who was supposed to care for you hated you and wanted to cause you pain. So yeah, a nurse who loves huge needles and hates mentally ill girls, let's never meet again. Edit. Thanks for everyone for your kind words of support. You don't even know what it means to me. For those wondering, I'm doing much better now. This happened 7 years ago, and I didn't report it. Very small town. I was scared that people I work with would find out about my suicide attempt if I pursued it. Plus, I was just focused on survival. You've all encouraged me though, and I'm doing my best to track this guy down and report it to someone. Sending my love to all of those who shared their own medical stories of abuse and trauma in the comments. This past September, I had taken a road trip down to Myrtle Beach with my family. It was myself, my mother, my sister, her husband and their 2 kids. We had used my car and both my sister and my husband's car to transport everything and all of us. We had rented a beach house for a little over a week and had a pretty great time. I was in the middle of a difficult point in my life and struggling with employment and being in between jobs and having just started 2 new jobs fresh. I was a little low on funds and worried about making my car payments and the like, so I opted to head home 2 days early with my car so I could try and get more hours at work. My family expressed being nervous as I planned to leave after dinner and drive through the night to get home. I consoled them that I'd be okay to be up all night and I'd just head straight home and only stop for gas and food as needed. I'm an excellent driver, a tad impatient, so I tend to go until I absolutely had to stop and take a break. However, this would be a 12-hour trip and I knew I needed breaks. So I made a point to stop at every rest stop and at least get out and stretch, so I stayed awake and didn't get too sore. Going through West Virginia, I'm sure you guys know how secluded their rest stops and visitor centres and the likes are, especially when you're heading north from the south, going through the mountains. I stopped at a visitor centre because they had advertising that they had fast food joints and I had to piss like a racehorse. This was sometime very late at night, maybe 1am to 3am sometime. Side note that sent shivers down my spine after what happened. I like to drive barefoot, so I pulled in, noticed the buildings with fast food were closed, so I drove around the parking lot under street light in front of the visitor centre so I could use the restroom. Laying out my door, I took my time putting my shoes on to walk inside, having looked around and not seeing anything out of the ordinary. I checked my phone and grabbed my wallet before standing up to walk in, making sure my car horn had beeped to signal the doors were locked. Walking towards the centre, I saw a man in a white hoodie standing at the edge of the sidewalk leaning into the centre. I didn't think much of it until I passed him and got an off vibe. I glanced over my shoulder and he was watching me walk in. For some reason, I glanced to my left as I turned back to face forward and noticed another man sitting on the benches that were on the other side of the tall thin bushes. Instantly I thought, nope. I went in and peed, and before I walked out of the bathroom, I called my roommate. As dumb as it was, because he was a good 4 to 6 hours away, I just felt safer. I gave him a rundown of my situation and made him stay on the phone with me. I started to walk out, and I couldn't see the man at the front of the sidewalk anymore. I glanced to my now right and saw both men standing next to a bench. Facing forward, I saw a couple walking in to presumably use the restroom as well. I had an impulse to ask them to walk with me, but my paranoia kicked in because I knew something was wrong somewhere in my situation and I didn't ask, thinking they might know the men. Walking briskly to my car, I explained to my roommate that the men were by the benches. Daring the smallest of the peeks over my shoulder again, I saw the man in the white hoodie walking towards me and told my roommate. Walking a few more paces, I looked back again and saw his pace had quickened. At this point, I told my roommate that he's following me to my car and I booked it. I thankfully had a fob key. I got my key out and ready, and I locked my car and practically threw myself in, not daring a glance back. I threw my car in reverse and gunned it backwards before going back into drive and sped off and didn't even stop to put my seatbelt on until I was at the exit to leave the parking lot. I didn't look back once. Stopped at the next toll road and filed a report, and the workers called for state troopers to head over to check things out. I didn't stop shaking for hours, and I refused to get out of my car until I was home. I horrified myself at the thought of, if those guys had paid attention and made their move more quickly, they could have incapacitated me at my car while I was facing the ground and putting my shoes on, and I could have had absolutely no defense. My mum was always very cautious of the bad things that could happen to her children. She would take all three of us, my brother, sister and I, to school in the morning as she worked close to the same time school started. I had been begging to bike to school since I got my new bike for my birthday a few months earlier, and she finally agreed. I was in grade 7, so 12 or 13 years old and female. My school was a 2 or 3 minute drive and around a 10 or 15 minute bike ride. I was eager to ride my new bike to school, as I had also gotten a new helmet and bike lock to go with it. School started at 8:30 to 9ish, so I left around 8. I liked to hang out in the yard with my friends before school started, so I'd always go earlier. The route to school was pretty much one straight line down one main road in my city. Now it's 8 o'clock in the morning, so it's relatively bright outside, and again, I'm on a well-populated main road, around the time everyone is heading to work and to school. So I'm about halfway to school and decide to cross the street, but not a crosswalk or traffic light, just kind of jaywalking or biking, if you will. As I'm stopped in someone's driveway, looking both ways to cross, I notice a black car pull up to my left and park on the side of the road. It's a 2-door Honda Civic type looking car, from what I can remember. I'm 21 years old currently, and all of the windows were tinted. I didn't think much of it. The only thing that crossed my mind is maybe I was blocking them from getting in their driveway, so I continued on crossing the street. From the corner of my eye I see a man, dressed in all black with his hood pulled up to hide his face, get out of the driver's side and walk around the back of the car to the passenger side. Before I get the chance to realise what's happening, He's opened the passenger side door and is pulling me by the arm off my bike in an attempt to put me in his car. And for what felt like forever, it was like every car on the street had disappeared. Any sign of help was completely gone. One of the busiest streets in my city felt like a gravel road in the middle of nowhere with nothing to be seen for miles. It also felt like one of those awful nightmares where you try and scream but nothing comes out. So you're just silently suffering until you wake up. But it was real. I couldn't scream. I can't explain that feeling any better than a nightmare, but not being able to wake up from it. These things didn't happen in my city, so I wasn't prepared for what to do in a situation like this. So I did the first thing that came to my mind. I aimed for the nuts. I shifted my weight to my right leg and kicked as hard as I possibly could with my left. I landed one kick, which I recall actually hurt my ankle a bit, so I can only imagine what it felt like on the receiving end, and he instantly let go. I didn't even look before I crossed the street, biking as fast as I possibly could. I remember trying to turn around and get a license plate, but my eyes were watery from all the tears that were streaming from them, and it still felt like making any noise was impossible. I knew my mum would have probably been at work by now, so I just continued biking to school, silently crying the entire way. I pulled into the schoolyard and dropped my bike. I didn't care to lock it or even ride it anywhere again, frankly. My school's front door was locked 24/7, and you had to ring the doorbell to get in, so I did exactly that. The secretary reminded me that I still had time to play outside before class started, and that's when I was finally able to speak again. "I need to call my mum," I screamed. The door opened instantly. I explained what happened to the secretary, and then to the principal, and my mum, and finally the police, who I'd refused to talk to until I spoke with my mum. The police arrived at the school shortly after, and took my statement. Then I went to the station after school to make another with my mum. A business across the street from where it happened had surveillance video, but it only captured the bottom 6 inches of the guy's car pulling up, his footsteps around the back of his car, and then the car pulling away shortly after. Basically, no solid leads on who the guy was or is. The same guy with the same body description and car description went on to attempt to kidnap 3 other girls, but was never caught. I don't really believe in a god, but I do pray that he was and is never successful. So, whoever you are, let's not meet. I came across this subreddit, and I knew I needed to share the story. This happened a few years ago, and since then, it's made me look at people very differently. I used to work in a strip mall, out in a fairly rural area. Most people are recognisable, even if you don't know them personally. People from out of the area frequently stop on their way through to other towns, so it's not like there's never out-of-towners, they just might be easy to spot. Like many places, we have a few homeless folks that hang around the shopping centre, and they occasionally ask people for food or change. It can be a nuisance, but the folks that worked at the shops kind of kept an eye on them to help them out or to keep track of how they're doing. There's this one guy, let's call him Shane, that over the course of the years has slowly gotten in worse and worse shape. He would be filthy and was clearly not doing well mentally, and was usually intoxicated. He always had several layers of clothing, and the pants that he wore on the outside of his other pants always sagged, making it hard for him to walk. He'd go missing for days, and then show up again. We'd wonder what happened to Shane, and ask around a bit, and a few days later he'd appear again. He was always so dirty. I always wished that there was a way that we could get him some help, but I really didn't know what to do. One day, I was out in a major city that was about 80 or so miles away from where I work. I happened to see a well-dressed, well-groomed gentleman that looked exactly like Shane, but at that moment, I figured my eyes were deceiving me. This guy had an expensive-looking shoulder bag, a new iPhone, and an Apple Watch. We were both in line at a popular food truck, and it was usually a long way too to order the food. Most people just minded their business and scrolled on their phones while waiting. This guy, on the other hand, is staring daggers at me. I keep avoiding looking that way, but I keep glancing to see if he's still there. And at the same time, I went to look at him because I'm so curious about how much he looks like Shane. I glance his way and I have to stumble back because he's practically right up against me. He has such intense eyes. He sort of whispers to me, but really intensely. He tells me he knows where I'm from and what shop I work at. He gets closer and I can tell he smells good, and I could even smell his minty breath. I ask how he knows, and he just smiles. I ask again, and he smiles brighter, exposing a perfectly clean set of teeth, minus one tooth. I'm almost positive Shane is missing that tooth. I edge away, feeling more than a little uncomfortable. His order gets called up, but they say his name is James. The next few days I don't see Shane anywhere around the shopping centre, and I ask around, and no one has seen him for days. Someone says they hope he's okay, another person shrugs and says they wish they could do something to help him. The next day, here he is, filthy as ever, grimy teeth, dirty fingernails, wearing all his layers. He sits on the curb outside my shop and asks people for change. I decide to venture out and confront him. I'm 100% sure it's him, but I don't understand how he could get so filthy and smelly in such a short time. I ask him if he was in the city, and he looks at me through bloodshot eyes and mumbles that he'd kill me if I tell anyone. This takes me aback, and I look at him puzzled. He slurs again that he will kill me if I tell anyone that he's not actually homeless. He starts to get worked up, and I ended up calling the police because I didn't know at that point what he was capable of. He wandered off, and I haven't seen him since. So Shane, let's not meet. Hi everyone, before I start this story, I just want to say that I'm not claiming the story to be true. This one is more of a creepy skinwalker type story, so if that's the sort of thing you enjoy, then that's the story that's coming up next. Anyway, I hope you all enjoy. Hi everyone, so I've been hanging out here for a while to see if anyone has a similar story to mine, but no dice. So I guess I'll just tell all of you my story and hope for the best. This is my first time actually talking about this to someone who wasn't there, as it still freaks me out whenever I go to sleep. So, this happened several years ago, back when I was like 16, and still in the Boy Scouts. One year, they were holding what they called the National Youth Leadership Training, NYLT for short. My troop decided to send me up for some training, seeing I was kind of the youth authority figure for my friends in the troop. Well, it seemed interesting, so I figured, what the heck, go for it. Big mistake. Later, I found out the training was going to be at a summer camp I frequented. For anonymity's sake, I will leave its name out. All I'll say is that it's in the High Sierras mountain range of California, and like a 15 to 25 minute hike from a creepy old logging camp from way back in the day. If I remember correctly, it was supposedly an old camp from a company called Pickering Lumber Company. Either way, clearly no one had used it for anything extensive for years, seeing as the buildings were all rotted wood, and the nails and railroad spikes were ancient and looked to be handmade. The camp itself wasn't anything unusual outside of the occasional odd experience people would report. Things like hearing the sounds of an old steampunk train every so often, even though the railroad had been decommissioned long before the summer camp even existed. So all in all, it was a lot of fun getting to know the group, to which I had been paired for the training activities. At the end of the week, when we had our last activity, that's when the truly traumatizing thing happened that prevents me from getting a decent sleep to this day. I will start with the event itself. The four of us, I'll call the others by fake names given that I can't remember them. So we have James, Alex, Sam and myself. The staff running the training gave us some food for the night, flashlights, a GPS tracker, along with a set of coordinates. They then set us off in the late evening and said to set up camp there for the night before breaking camp and returning. Nothing too stressful, seeing as I was relatively familiar with these woods, at least during the day. At night it would change, and I always felt like I was being watched from just around the next tree. So remember the GPS tracker they gave us? Absolute garbage. The thing died on us like halfway there, after it started leading us in circles. Back the way we came, way off course. It messed up in just about every way you could imagine. Frustrated beyond belief and tired and hungry at what was probably around 8 or 9 at night, we decided that we would just set up camp in the next open spot we came across, eat our food and sleep before making our way back in daylight. So we came to a bit of a clearing on the side of a hill, had our dinner of terribly watered down soup, gathered some sticks and stones in a sort of large U with the opening pointing down the hill to keep the wind off of us while we were sleeping. Even though none of us had ever heard of bears or mountain lions in the area, we decided to sleep in shifts just in case. It never hurts to be cautious. So during my second shift, probably sometime between 12 AM and 3 AM, I was laying on my sleeping bag, looking at the moon and stars. Something further down the hill caught my attention. It sounded like a stick breaking on the ground. Rather than shining my flashlight and ruining my now night-adjusted vision, I decided just to kind of look without moving too much in its direction, seeing as I was tired and didn't want to get up. Then, probably about 50 or 60 feet down the hill, I saw a large silhouette and glowing green eyes of a creature slowly creeping towards us. Now, I knew the standard prey animals of deer in the area generally didn't move like that, so I grabbed my light and my flashlight from the hill and woke up the other three as silently as I could, as I didn't want that thing to jump us before we were ready. As people were waking up, they looked in the direction I mentioned, and they generally whispered something along the lines of, "The fuck is that?" Then it was probably no more than 10 to 15 feet away when we jumped up with our flashlights and knives, and the tallest one, James, throwing a rock at the thing as soon as my light showed us what had been stalking us. To this day, I still don't know exactly what I saw that night, but even though it freaked the hell out of me, I'll describe it the best I'm able to. This thing was completely hairless, and white as printer paper. This thing was not very tall, on all fours, only come up to stomach or chest height. I didn't see any ears that I could tell. It had the muzzle of a dog, completely black eyes when not in the dark. Its chest had the same strange outward of shape of a canine, but its stomach looked almost human, if far too small. The creature had those weird hind legs and knees that dogs have, where they are bent at two places. Its arms looked human, but the arms and legs were elongated oddly, while its feet were incredibly thin at the toes, and fingers each were thinner and longer than normal, and tapered off into claws. The rock that James threw as soon as he saw the thing struck it hard in the side of its head. It lifted itself to its hind legs, easily dwarfing us, before shrieking at us and darting off down the hill. For hours after, this thing circled us, avoiding the light, taunting us, making muffled coughing sounds. Occasionally, this thing spoke to us in a high-pitched, distorted voice. It sounded like this thing was repeating what it said earlier from the hike to the campsite. Then I heard it try and mimic my voice from earlier when I was complaining about the malfunctioning GPS. Then it said the thing that most disturbed me. This thing calmly said, "Come out and play." Then it was gone. The next morning we looked for some sort of evidence that this thing existed, and we just didn't have some weird group hallucination. We saw a few prints that looked like handprints, and at the top of the hill within the view of our camp, we saw a line of stacked rocks pointing off deeper into the woods, and sitting at the top was the rock that James had thrown. Ready to get the hell out of there, we went and broke camp, when I noticed we were about 200 to 300 feet from the old logging cabin that the camp counselor had called Rosie's cabin. This freaked me out, seeing as for years all the scouts had been banned from going anywhere near this cabin. After we got back and decided to never speak of it again, I wanted to do a bit more digging to see if anyone else had heard about it. So a few weeks later, I'm back at the camp for a summer camp, and I do some digging and asked a few of the older counselors about the cabin. Supposedly, as they told me about hearing my story, several years ago they went in there when they were planning on expanding the camp to the old logging camp, and found a camp they could only describe as a nest made out of a shredded mattress, leaves, and bits of bones from squirrels and birds. To see what would happen, they destroyed the nest, and the next day it was back the way it was before. Then I asked if anyone had seen what made the nest, and they said I should go ask the climbing counsellor, as he'd seen something odd up there a few years back. Supposedly, the climbing instructor a few years ago had planned to build a climbing tower out of the abandoned camp, but never finished it, because one night, when he was nearly done, he decided to sleep on top of it and finish the tower the next morning. He said he was awoken late that night to something circling the tower on the ground, and at one point the counsellor said this thing looked directly up at him with its glowing pale green eyes. Sadly, I wish I could tell all of you I know what it is that I saw out there in the woods. The best I can say is that, well, my best bet is that it was a Wendigo. I know it's the wrong place and description. Look, I'm not talking about the freak from the pet cemetery. I'm talking about the original, straight out of Algonquin, Native American myth. According to the Algonquin, the Wendigo was a white shrieking monster, tall as the trees, that would prey on those foolish enough to wander from their settlements into the lonely places. Other than the famed Wendigo, I have no idea what hunted us when we were children, and I dread the idea that one day when I have children, if they want to be scouts, that they'll have to face the same beast I once did. It's been ages since I hopped on Reddit, but here I am to bring a story to you all that happened not too long ago. And while it happened to me, it didn't start with me, but my mother. Though somehow I became the focus of it. A couple of weeks ago, my mum was coming back from the store around 10 PM, got herself a pack of cigarettes, and was hanging out with a friend of hers as she did so. On their way back, they came across Jeremy. It was a guy they've both, and even I have seen a couple of times. Nothing major, just an acquaintance we barely spoke to. Though he was either high as hell this time around or drunk, or both, I don't know. I do know this wasn't how he usually acts. Jeremy was angry over something, and came up to them and started screaming about wanting to fuck them and pulled his penis out, in public. After both my mum and her friend tried to just walk away from the situation, he started attacking my mum. Both my mum and her friend started fighting back, and they managed to get him to stop, and made their way back to her house, where I'm currently at, unaware of what the hell is going on. However, note that I said stop, not leave. He lived in the same building as I do, and was following them from a distance away. So they both made their way upstairs, when my mum realised she had left her key inside. Nothing new. She's pretty forgetful, and I'm generally here to open the door when she does. Problem being, Jeremy made his way upstairs too, past where his floor is, and to ours. And he tried to fight her again. I opened the door to my mum shouting my name, and being absolutely clueless as she entered and tried to close the door. But Jeremy pushed the door open before it could be shut, and made his way into our apartment. This is where I got involved, and grabbed a knife and threatened him to get out, which he did. I have no idea how he managed to get this impression, but he seemed to think I was trying to fight him, because after we made sure to slam the door, the moment he exited and lock it, he started screaming at the top of his lungs about how we were pussies and to call the police, claiming he knows the landlord and get him to delete any footage caught from outside the building and the hallways inside the building. My mum, being a quick thinker, started recording him from the door as he banged and kicked the door, trying to open it. Eventually he left when he heard we were actually calling the cops. You'd think this would be over, right? No. It keeps going. After a couple of minutes, he returns to the door with a knife and starts stabbing our door while screaming and insulting us at the top of his lungs, saying that he'll kill the cops too. The police can clearly hear him from the phone. I think that's why they came this time around, since, as I mentioned in my last Reddit post, these guys are absolutely useless. The doors in the building are strong stuff, metal I think, I don't know. But while he made some light holes and scratches, he couldn't do much to it. So he shouts he'll be downstairs waiting for the cops, which we of course inform the cops currently on the phone of. And like perfect timing, while he makes his exit, they make their entrance, both using two different elevators. There are two. 4 officers knock on our door, and we open up and tell them what was going on and what happened from start to finish. While my mum showed the cops the footage she recorded, I was taking pictures of the damages to the door. The cops, clearly not wanting to be here, begrudgingly said to come downstairs with them. So me and my mum did, to which we heard screaming from the first floor. We were on the 5th floor and heard him perfectly, though his screaming stopped real quick when 4 cops showed up. Instantly went, "Oh shit," and playing nice with the cops. The cops were not having any of it and arrested Jeremy there and then. His friends were there, asking what did he do, screaming and shouting at the cops, before eventually running off. Jeremy was taken away. I sent the damages of the door to the lawyers, and don't know what happened about that. Silence. So you'd think that's where this story ends, right? No. Jeremy got off a restraining order, though since he lived in the same building as us, we couldn't stop him from simply being in the building. He was only not allowed to talk to us or cause any problems. This didn't last long. On my way to the store maybe 2 weeks later, he and his friends were all outside the building in a group, chatting and drinking. When I walked out, Jeremy instantly switched up the topic, saying, "You see that kid? I'm gonna fuck him up." He got the cops on me, fuck the restraining order. I wanted to get away from that as soon as possible, but I had left the building and would need to get close to the group I had just finished taking a couple of steps away from in order to get back inside. So I quickly made my way to the store. Since I'd be in public with people present, I ended up just getting everything I needed from the store while trying to call my mum to tell her what happened. Didn't answer. Great. And here's where I admit I was a little dumb. I should have instantly called the cops, but I didn't. I just didn't remember what Jeremy was wearing, and I'm honestly a wreck with anxiety. I wanted to first see if the group was still there before I attempted to make a phone call. They weren't. And I quickly made my way upstairs too and informed my mum, who calmed me down and got me to call the police. The exact same police last time showed up, and thank God for that, since they were all aware of Jeremy being a nutcase from last time. But this time, we had no proof other than what would just end up being a he said she said scenario. So they had us sit in the hallway while they called their boss to make sure the arrest would be okay due to the previous history and restraining order. All the while, Jeremy was in the staircase, laughing and being extremely loud with his friends, and sister from what I learned. Eventually, the police got an okay from their boss, and we all made our way to the staircase. I tried to stay as out of sight as possible, as they once again arrested him. Jeremy claimed to be unaware of what he was being arrested for, and his friends left once again. His sister, who was in her mid-20s from what I could guess, was screaming though, insulting them and saying he was being arrested for no reason. Jeremy was hauled away again, and I have no idea what happened. No calls from attorneys or the police, no nothing. Though I ended up seeing him within the week, straying from eye contact with me or my family. Usually walks away the moment he sees us. I wish more came of this, but I'm happy we're being left alone all the same. Though he is always pissed at seeing me. I just came across this sub, and I figured the story was perfect to share here. I shared it in Our Scary Stories 2 years ago, not realising that sub was mainly for fictional spooks, but I promise you all this is 100% real, and still gives me nightmares 4 years later. When I was 18, I worked at my college's residence building at the front desk, and I think I almost got assaulted, or murdered, you be the judge. During the summer, the building operated as a hotel, so 2.5 floors were hotel rooms, and half of the 3rd floor were student rooms. The whole building was operated with a hotel swipe key system that was pretty outdated, and all the doors were powered by 4 AA batteries. If the batteries died, there was a decently lengthy process to replace them and reprogram the door. A dark-haired guy came to the front desk from inside the building while I was working an overnight shift at around 1 or 2 AM, and said he left his keycard in his room. I made him a new one and made my first error of the night. Hotel guests could have as many room keys as remade as they wanted, hypothetically. Students, however, were supposed to be given a temporary key card and charged $2 to be returned when theirs is located. I gave him a new key for his room and asked if he wanted a student or hotel guest, and he replied, "Student." At this point, I should have checked our system to charge his account, but I was caught up in doing administrative duties and forgot. I used to trust people way too easily at this job, but quickly learned not to. Late that night, maybe around 3 or 4 AM, he came to the desk again and asked if he could get into his room. I asked if he just forgot his key again, and he said no, the door wasn't working. I asked if the light was coming on when he swiped his card, and he said no, so I figured the batteries were dead. I told him I'd have to change the batteries, and I went out to his room with him. He asked me for my name, and I told him. He didn't tell me his. I opened the room door manually with a master key and told him I'd have to prop it open while I worked on the back panel to replace the batteries. He said, "No, it's okay, close it," and closed and deadbolted the door locked. Really weird, but I tried not to think about it. I had changed the batteries on plenty of doors by this point, and some students were iffy about having their doors propped open for their room to be on display for anyone walking by. He had a really thick accent, and I thought he might be an international student. We had a lot of students from other countries where English wasn't their first language. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, and thought maybe it was just a language barrier issue. At this point though, it really felt like something was wrong, but I tried to ignore it so I didn't freak him out. While I was trying to focus on fixing the door as quickly as possible, he kept trying to entice me to go further into the room, saying his bed was broken and he needed me to take a look at it. There was something underneath it that needed to be fixed, etc. He held out a little gold house key and said, "I have a key, go get it," and threw it under the bed. He said there was a leak under the fridge. He just kept trying to get me to go down on the ground, throwing random problems at me. Obviously I told him no, I'd send maintenance up in the morning to take a look at whatever was broken. I had my back to him and he asked me if I would take my glasses off. I said no, I need them to see. His tone of voice changed, and in the most steady, chilling manner he said, "Ella, it's okay, you can take them off." And from behind me, he reached around and tried to take off my glasses. I swatted his hand away, trying to remain composed, and said, "No, thanks, I need to keep them on," even though he was creeping me the hell out. I didn't want to be rude to him. I didn't want to get in trouble if he complained about me, or risk upsetting him and having him yell at me. I got up to grab something from the door repair kit, and undid the door deadbolt and opened it up in the process. He jumped towards the door to close it again, and told me to keep it closed. I told him no, it had to be open to start reprogramming it from the front. While I held the door open with my foot and grabbed something from the door repair kit, he started playing with the little wispy hairs at the top of my forehead and trying to touch my shoulder. I swatted him away and asked him not to touch me and focused on getting the hell out of there. He once again tried to get me to follow him to the bedroom, saying the bed was broken, and I went as far as the doorframe to see if I could spot any actual problems with his bed. This is when I realised he had nothing in his room. No dishes in the kitchen, no shower curtain in the bathroom, no sheets on the bed, nothing. This wasn't his room. My brain once again went back to the international student theory, thinking he'd just arrived today and hadn't got a chance to buy anything yet. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew something was wrong. I fiddled around with the door for a few more seconds before announcing that it was fixed, and quickly gathered the door kit and left. Before I'd reached the elevator, he came back out without his shoes on to follow me. He tried to get back into his shoes and called out, "Ella, the door isn't fixed, you need to come back." I went back and opened the door manually, and told him if the door was broken I'd have to send up maintenance to fix it in the morning. I knew he was going to follow me to the elevator again, so I closed the door behind me once he was inside and ran down the stairwell as fast as I could. When I got to the front desk, I checked the computer and saw the room he was in was supposed to be empty. It wasn't a student room or hotel room. I locked myself in a back office and called campus security. He came down a few minutes later and went behind the desk. I yelled at him to get on the other side and wait, now that I knew he wasn't a resident. He tore the corner of a slip of paper I'd been sitting on the desk and drew a flower on it, then put it on the top of my papers. When security arrived, he ran back up to the empty room and tried to convince him he lived there so he wouldn't have to leave. He kept showing them his key, which had decided to work on the door somehow again. They escorted him back downstairs and came to ask me if he really lived there. Obviously he didn't. That's why I called you guys crying and terrified. He kept interjecting to argue that he did live there, but couldn't even recall his room number when asked. Security asked him for his student card, and he couldn't produce it, so they told him he'd have to leave if he couldn't prove that he lived there. While they were grabbing his information, I listened from the office and could immediately tell he was lying. The phone number he gave was just a bunch of numbers. The name he gave was just prefixed by, as if he was trying to think of a name. When they asked him for his address, he just said, across the street. One security guard asked me if he lived in the apartments across the street, and he said yes, but couldn't tell them what building number it was. He said his apartment number was 1200, but I moved into the building a few months later, and apartment 1200 doesn't exist. When security asked what his purpose was to be sneaking in a room, he'd just come up with ums and ahs, and saying he didn't know. They'd ask, were you trying to see a friend? Do you know anyone who lives here? Were you here to hurt someone? And he kept fidgeting and saying, I don't know, no reason, I was just here. At one point, he tried to tell them he was my friend, at which point I poked my head out of the office to say that I literally had never seen him before that night. He left. We didn't call the police because he didn't actually do anything, but it was still really unsettling. Later it dawned on me how he could have figured out that that room was vacant. One of the housekeepers had been using it as her personal break room. A few days later, a housekeeper came to the desk and told me they found a door deadbolted open, the TV on, and a housekeeper inside watching TV. She must have forgotten to close the door when she left that night, and when the creep let himself into the building, he found it. I never saw him again, and to this day I have no clue what he was doing there. I haven't worked there since last winter, and overnight shifts still have me the heebie-jeebies.
The year was 1980. My wife and I lived in the suburbs of San Diego. Normal Heights, to be exact. We lived in a small house we rented after moving from Imperial Beach about 10 miles to the south. I worked as a quality assurance manager at a small machine shop nearby. It was a small, quiet neighborhood. This was after the war in Vietnam had ended and a lot of the Vietnamese refugees had come to America, a lot of whom had moved into our area. They were friendly enough. However, we were not very sociable people and mostly kept to ourselves. It was me, my wife, and our 2 dogs, Jeep and Buck. Jeep was wicked smart. At times, it was almost like interacting with another human being. Buck was more of a doofus, but a master escape artist. I couldn't count how many times I'd gone to look for him when he'd find his way out of the yard or run amok through the neighborhood. Nothing unusual or strange happened at that house, nor was I ever worried about my family's safety. Most people knew I was not the one to mess with. After all, I had a rather brutal upbringing. My father hung around with bikers and mafia types. Well, I was practically raised by 1%ers. In fact, not long before that, the police had broken into my house, guns drawn, ordering me on the ground and asserting that they would blow my head off. I'll, let you use your imagination to guess why. So, as you can imagine, I'm not easily frightened. That is, until that one night. A night I don't think I'll ever forget. My wife and I were dead asleep that night. I'd gotten off of work late and I was exhausted. When I suddenly awoke to a sound I can only describe as a car smashing into a brick building at full speed. That sent me to vertical in no time flat. My wife and I stared at each other, both of us too shocked to move. After a second or two, I motioned for my wife to stay in bed as I made my way cautiously through the house. It all happened so quick, I couldn't tell where it had come from or what it could possibly have been. I looked out my back door, unable to see anything, as a heavy marine fog had rolled in, leaving me only 10 feet or so of visibility. I quickly grabbed a flashlight from the cabinet by the door and carefully made my way out of the door. The first thing I noticed as I stepped out into my yard was the silence. There were no crickets chirping, no dogs barking, absolute stillness. I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end as I began to become more and more uneasy as I slowly moved through the yard. My yard was small, surrounded by an old 6-foot-tall wooden fence. There was a single low-wattage flashlight above the back porch, which only served to increase the growing feeling of eerie dread that came over me. As I approached the back gate, I stopped dead in my tracks as I shone the flashlight up onto the gate. Or, more accurately, where the gate used to be. I stood there, amazed. It looked as though the gate had been completely ripped off the fence. What could have possibly torn a heavy 6-foot wooden gate straight from the fence? Even the post was torn apart. I shone my flashlight up past the gate, and to my disbelief, I saw my gate across the alley in my neighbour's yard, on the other side of his short chain-link fence, about 25 or 30 feet from where I stood. It was then that I decided whatever had done that was not something I wanted to meet, not with just a flashlight. I turned around and bolted back inside. Needless to say, we didn't get much sleep that night. A few days went by, and all was quiet, as it always had been, until our neighbour, an older, heavier-set lady, showed up at our door. Apparently, she had found Jeep pouring at her door that morning. However, Buck never came home, nor did we ever see him again. That was 20 years ago, and to this day, I don't know what ever happened to old Buck. But what I do know is that shortly after Jeep returned home, my wife and I saw a news story about a group of Vietnamese refugees who had been detained by the local police for hunting neighborhoods for dogs. All of this only after a neighbor had happened upon them cooking the poor creatures a dozen at a time.